Navy Matters.
Hello and welcome to History Repeats on HMTV. I'm Liam Carballal, as always, and joining me again is Richard Acritelli. Richard.
Liam, how you doing?
Yeah. Richard, today I was hoping we could talk about something a little more contemporary, especially all that's going on in the Middle East right now. I was hoping we could talk about Iran and Israel. As we speak, I believe the Iranian government has said that they are going to continue their nuclear production program. Richard, where do we start with this? Like, perhaps we can talk about like the Shah and why the Iranian Revolution happened in the first place.
Well, it's a very complex area of the world. It's always been a tough area of the world. For the United States, it's always been, we kind of need to be there in that part of Asia with the fuel reserves. It's a strategic area.
Strait of Hormuz and all the oil supplies that go through there.
And it's interesting that you bring up the Strait of Hormuz because with the most recent fighting between the Israelis and the Iranians, it was always a concern that the Iranians could shut down the Straits of Hormuz.
Yeah.
And they would never dare to try that. So that turned out to be a lot of talk, and that turned out to be talk that in the past kind of altered markets and scared the United States and Western European countries and Middle Eastern countries as well, some of which have become more moderate to support the United States, of which the Iranians have scared the heck out of some of those Gulf states. And some of the more like conservative countries have kind of shifted more, maybe away from the very serious religion, the strict religion, with more of an open view on things.
I think the Saudis have been trying to reach out to Israel.
Yeah, which is the interesting thing, because what was it, October 7th attacks?
Yeah,
that Israel and Saudi Arabia are about to sign like a pretty much a peace accord and agreement. Anytime peace comes, comes the recognition and trade and more friendship itself.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at Iran and Israel, the most recent fighting is very serious. It's surprising because the rhetoric has always been there, and now the rhetoric has turned into the fighting with the Israelis. I mean, which is amazing. They've controlled the skies within a day or two over that, 14, 15 days worth of fighting. They bombed anything that moved in terms of on the roads. They went after their infrastructure. They went after their, the nuclear program itself, which, President Obama had signed those accords with the belief that, all right, at least we could still slow down the Iranians, and there's something to negotiate with in terms of enrichment of the uranium. President Trump pulled out of that in 2018, and Netanyahu actually had said that it was probably one of the worst agreements because it didn't completely slow down the Iranians itself. Of which the Israelis were, because they were going after probably one of the most dangerous jobs that you could have in the world. Okay, you think about them, right? There's a lot of dangerous ones. Is being a Iranian nuclear scientist, because the Israelis
assassinations.
We're picking those guys off. You had Israeli Mossad agents that blended into society, driving scooters and putting magnetic explosives onto their cars. So they're making a right to car. They're making a left, and a minute later, as they're off and gone, there's a controlled explosion. So those guys were getting, picked off. And then Soleimani was killed by American forces when he was in Iraq. And then you had these proxies, which the big one, was in Yemen with the Houthis, targeting Western shipping. And then we're fighting like a what would you call it, undeclared war against that country to keep open shipping lanes going from the Mediterranean into the Red Sea, into the Arabian Gulf, and then into the
proxy war.
Indian Oceans. And that's what the Iranians over the last 10 or 15 years has really done well with is, all right, we're going to only get our hands so dirty, but we're going to pay others, give them support, give them weapons, maybe give them some intelligence. And they're going to go after Israel, and they're going to go after the United States and Western Europe, and they're going to feel our strength. Well, I think that kind of came to an end because when the Iranians fully fought the Israelis, none of those proxies came up. And then the irony of it is that the Russians came out and said, well, we'll help make peace. And then Trump came out and said, well, you have another war that I want you to make peace with. He was telling them in a nice way, don't be ridiculous. You're fighting this brutal war in Ukraine. We begging you to make peace, and you're not doing that. And then, you're talking about the Ukraine, which is interesting because you have Iranian drones going into the hands of the Russians. Right? So you had those Iranian drones, and you better believe that the Ukrainians got their hands on it, turned them over to us, and we turned them over to the Mossad and to Netanyahu and everything else. So, as bad as the war has been in, the Ukraine, we've been able to determine some of the weapons that the Iranians have had. And, they're like a little league team playing the New York Yankees right now. You know what I'm saying? There's no... up here in Glen Cove, it's like little kids playing the Yankees. There's no comparison. There's no equal strength. And the Iranians keep leaving themselves out in the open. And the interesting thing is, I'm a couple of years older than you, right? Is that I remember when the Shah was in power and, and then, they lost control, and then, the Ayatollah comes in and students and, they end up taking American hostages. And at Stony Brook University, there was this huge rock right off of Nichols Road that said, get our hostages back, right? So from that time period, from 1979, history repeats. I remember being a kid in the 1980s, and we actually took over an Iranian oil platform, and we took Iranians hostage and the gunboats and stuff like that, right? But we've never seen it like this here, where the Israelis go in there, they take over full control of the skies. About 6 or 7 months ago, they took out all their air defenses. And it just shows like how tough the Israelis are, how capable they are, how smart they are. And I'm sure in the background, there's always that alliance with us where we're kind of saying, all right, you might want to hit in this spot here. And so we're giving them some, materials, some supplies, some money, some know-how, but they're carrying out, and they've done a hell of a job. They really have.
And I think it also, when the Iranian president died a few years ago, I think they said the leading cause was just the aircraft was extremely old. And the Iranians are not getting modern parts. So I have to assume that is a big contributor as
well. And
the
Iranians still have some fighter planes that we gave the Shah in the 1970s. Okay, I'm 50 years old. That's almost 50 years ago. Which is amazing. So it's a very complex issue.
But this is not necessarily a new issue. I mean, the British and the Soviet Union invaded Iran in the 1940s.
Yeah, 1941.
To oust the Shah's father. Because they were not cooperating.
And they thought that the Shah at that time was pro-German. And even though, it's going to be well before like the wide use of petroleum and stuff like that, the countries still realized that area of the world was so important. They knew what was under the ground there. So you're seeing like almost like that unholy alliance between the British and the Soviets. We get involved December 7th, 1941, and Germany declares war on us 2 days later. So it's a very interesting angle. And then during World War II, Iran was more or less neutral, but you have the Tehran Conference. And then the Soviets are going to be there until about 1946. There was a concern that they were going to set up a puppet government and so on.
There's a 2-day party. And
and then, like they're trying to take over like Azerbaijan and all those little republics Armenia and, Georgia and all those little countries, which was already loosely tied to the Soviet Union. So we're there for a long time, and the British are there for a long time. The problem is after World War II, while the British are still pretty powerful, they have to shed parts of their empire. They can't afford it. So while they're holding on to some of these strategic areas, the United States is going to be filling that vacuum. And then you get guys like Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles, the brothers that are going to come out of World War II, who's going to run the OSS, right, the Office of Strategic Services, and they're going to be kind of like the grandfathers to the CIA, right, the Central Intelligence Agency, and then they're going to get their hands dirty in two major areas outside of Europe. Is going to be Guatemala, closer to home here, and then Iran.
Arbenz.
And what you're going to look at is that, we're no Boy Scouts. We see that these countries could pose a threat, that communism can grow, especially within those strategic areas.
Domino theory.
Yeah, well, you got that liquid gold under the ground. There, there's going to be some explosions going on and some assassinations and so on. And then Khrushchev on the other side, he said, all right, maybe we can assassinate the Shah. So the Shah was always in a rough area, but the Shah had a lot of money.
Iraq and armies.
And then later on with Iraq and everything else. So, it's tough with your question because it's just a very complex, it's like a spider web of problems, the Shah is a funny leader because when his gig was up, we were starting to kind of say, we don't think he could hold on. And then the Shah comes out and says, well, I don't think I have Western, support. But in the 50s, the 60s, and parts of the 70s, he kind of westernized the country.
The White Revolution?
Yeah, the White Revolution. I mean, what are you looking at with that? He's starting to take some land away from the clerics, and that's going to upset the religious, faction, right?
Ayatollah
in terms of
Khomeini.
A young Ayatollah Khomeini and a very strict religion. They're going to give more rights to the women. They're going to look to westernize. They're going to look to give, basically some of the private, or the government-owned more to the private and get more money flowing in there. And then they're going to end up having oil companies like BP is going to sell millions and millions of barrels of oil. The problem is that not enough of that money's coming back. The poor keep getting poorer, and the wealthier that are tied to the Shah, they're living, above, everyone else. And it's going to be very, very close where people are starting to see that there's a real big divide in the country. It's like the haves and the have-nots, The minority of the people are controlling everything. The majority of the people are, getting poorer and poorer. So
you mentioned Allen Dulles and the foundation of the CIA. It should be noted, Iran had a brief fling with democracy in the early 50s, up until Operation Ajax. The CIA was supposedly involved with overthrowing the government there, and reinstalling the Shah as an absolute ruler. And so we're moving now.
So there was a concern that that leadership would not be friendly towards the West. And the Americans and the British are always going to, kind of get involved with this area of the world. If the British can't handle it, then the United States will handle it. Because they're very concerned about the Soviet influence. And it's going to be, we're going to kind of shoot ourselves in the foot a little bit, because we're going to keep these leaders in, or at the moment that we don't believe that they're friendly to the West, then we're going to get rid of them. And then in 1979, it's like that snowball effect. Okay, wait a second. This is the United States meddling within our affairs, right? The great Satan and everything else. So it's not gonna do us any favors by any means. So it's gonna be a rough. The end of it's gonna be very rough, because that's what we're dealing with today. So,
as we're slowly clicking towards, I think, like the 45th anniversary of the taking the hostage crisis in that I think we should kind of like look back at some of the things the Islamic Republic has done, because they have done some monstrous things, and I think a lot of people miss that. For one thing, during the Iran-Iraq War, before I go over, can you speak to the Iran-Iraq War?
Yeah, a little bit. The unwritten rule, or really the written rule after World War I, was not to use chemical weapons.
Yeah.
So chemical weapons is always the poor man's nuclear bomb. It's been around forever, right?
Yep.
Easy to make, easy to develop. Heck, off of Long Island, right? Yeah, Plum Island, in terms of, what do they call that? Department of, what was that? What do they call that? It's not the Department of Energy. Is it Homeland Security or Department of maybe Agriculture? Okay, in terms of what runs Plum Island, and they get into all that biological, right? So it's not far removed from where we are right here, right? Well, the Iranians and Iraqis are going to use chemical weapons against each other. Okay, and then you have Saddam Hussein, who's going to use it against the Kurds in Kurdistan, in the northern part of Iraq, which is in part of Iran and Syria with the Kurdish people, right? So they fight a brutal war against each other. And what does the Ayatollah realize? Is they have to start modernizing in order to protect themselves. And they want to be able to build that atomic bomb. The Israelis, they had the policy that they neither say they had the bomb, okay? They don't admit it, but they don't deny it.
Yeah.
But everyone knows that they have it, okay? I think they have somewhere between 80 and like 150 bombs or whatever the
I've
case
heard like
is.
250.
Yeah,
but
250 bombs. You know, it's like, there's all kinds of speculation, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, the Israelis actually spied on us a little bit with Jonathan Pollard back in the 1980s. And, you know, they had that 60 Minutes interview of him where they actually had, like, I think it was naval intelligence sitting right next to him. So the moment he had to say anything, they were going to jump right on him. So the Israelis understood that they needed to have that weapon because they were surrounded by their enemies. Okay? The Iranians, what they wanted to be like is like the Pakistan effect. Before Pakistan had the nuclear bomb, you could push them around. After Pakistan got the nuclear bomb, you couldn't. All right, and that's probably more deterrence between them and the Indians.
Security.
With security, you know, and they just had a flare up with them and the Indians, right? At one point, the Indians look better. At the other point, the Pakistanis look better. It's never really going to improve. You know, maybe for 6 months, for a year, they just stay away from each other, and then the tensions come back. When you look at the Iranians, you know, for the longest period of time, they want to get that device in the worst way. Okay? And it's scary with the United States because how long ago was World War II now? 81 years, right? So what you're looking at, okay, is at the end of World War II. It was 80 years? What's the anniversary? 80 years, is it?
August will be 80 years.
80 years, right? We're 80 years ahead of other countries. Think about that with the nuclear bomb. Okay, and then the hydrogen bomb comes and all the rocket technology. And then you get more bang for the buck and mutually assured destruction in the 50s and the 60s and so on. Iran is that far behind us, but they're still pretty close to developing it. And the problem is they'll use it. Okay, they'll most likely use it. Okay, and Israelis have been saying for years that it is not within our interest to allow this country to have that weapon because they will use it. Okay.
Well, maybe not nuclear weapons, but I do know this. The Iranians have done some really heinous things over the years. I was going to say during the Iran-Iraq War, for example, to clear Iraqi landmines, minefields, they would go into poorer neighborhoods, round up children, give them a copy of the Quran and a plastic key that would lead them to the kingdom of heaven. And then have them march into the minefields to try and clear them. So that's who we're dealing with.
It was a brutal war. I remember when they were negotiating that, and they would always have busloads full of prisoners between Iraqis and Iranians and so on. But you know, the interesting thing is like when the Shah was in power, the Iranian Jews were actually treated better. Those were like some of the reforms that you saw, and you know, trying to be westernized and so on. The problem is that the Shah went too far,
alienating the
conservative religious faction.
Yeah.
That, I mean, they're saying now that you have a whole population of people that want to get away from that strict Islamic fundamentalist because they know it could only take them so far.
Yeah.
So that's where you kind of get into, the separation of church and state that you just don't see over there.
Yeah.
Israel itself, very strongly religious country, right? But it's also a democratically elected government.
Yeah.
So there is
going to say what you want about them. They chose them.
Yeah, and you're going to have a separation of church and state, you know? But what you're looking at here is just, I don't know, with the Iranians, I don't know what they're thinking because Trump just recently said that we are willing to attack them again if we have to.
Yeah.
And Trump doesn't want to go in there, but they said that again, So, and that goes against some of his America First protocols and stuff like that. And they did it. And it showed really American strength in a huge, huge way. So,
yeah. It's a complicated issue. Is there anything, any other subject on the Iranian things that we think we should cover?
Yeah, I don't know. I would think in terms of the American military power.
Yeah.
And its connection to Israel at this point. Now, Trump, this is his second time in.
Yeah.
Hegseth, who I haven't always been a big supporter of, in terms of him leading the Department of Defense. I thought maybe he was a little too young for that, a little inexperienced within government. But they played it right with that attack. Instead of sending the decoys out, going to Guam and then across the country. And the scary thing is, and maybe this is good, it shows the Chinese and the Russians that, we're only going to get pushed so far and we will use our own power, was that the Iranians had no idea that those bombers were up there. And what you're looking at is that they dropped a number of bombs, and those bombs are 30,000 pounds each. Okay.
Bunker bombs.
The bunker bombs, which all the media loved to say was the bunker bombs. All you heard was say it was the bunker bombs, right? That was the buzzword,
Yeah.
And up until that point, they had no idea what those bombs were, right? And it shows the technology of the United States and how far we're ahead of these other countries still.
Do you
the
think
Chinese, the Russians, they talk a good game until they actually do it, right? You have the Russians saying they're going to invade and they're going to go up against everyone, where they're having a hard time in Ukraine still, right?
Yeah.
And then you have the United States fly bombers out of the middle of our country, thousands of miles away. They have to refuel those planes, right?
Yep.
You have crews that are up for hours on end, and they put it really into the pickle barrel itself.
Yeah.
It's like a quarterback throwing a perfect spiral all the way down the field to his receiver. That's what we did. It was pinpoint precision.
Yeah.
And it's amazing. You look at the strength of this country, and we don't want to get involved in certain things.
U.S.
But what you're looking at is like sometimes that America First doesn't always work out. That you have to intervene. And, the Israelis could only go so far because they didn't have those armaments. I mean, they did a hell of a job. They really did. Okay. But the United States showed a tremendous amount of strength, and, sometimes, I don't know, Trump, he doesn't have much discipline over his mouth and certain things he says and does, right? But he basically, it was a surprise. He gave them 2 weeks. And 3 days later, we're bombing, outside Tehran into some of these, different scientific locations, some of the different plants and so on.
Yep.
And then the one which was so many stories below ground, it's something. And then of course politics comes out and they say, we didn't hit as hard as we thought. You don't know that until the smoke clears.
Yeah.
And then obviously if the Iranians are still able to keep on going with it, there's going to be another American attack because the Israelis aren't going to allow it, and we certainly showed that we're not going to allow it as well there. So,
all right. Well, it's always good to have you.
Yeah,
Rich.
no problem,
Thank
Liam.
you. This is History Repeats. I'm your host, Liam Carballal on HMTV. Thank you, and stay tuned till next time.